In addition to the three models that we have just described, some other decision-making theories and models have also been proposed. One that definitely deserves mention is prospect theory, which has been proposed by Tversky and Kahneman in the late 1970s and has been developed more recently. This theory is in its original form applicable mainly in the field of economics, but it contains important psychological principles related to decision making. One point that has to be highlighted is that people generally do not consider utility aspects in decision making situations in a calculated way when they make decisions finally with regard to alternatives that involve risks or uncertainty. Instead, they seem to adopt general approaches or principles depending on other situational factors. When the outcomes seem to be positive, that is, with more gains than losses, people tend to avoid taking risks. That is, when things seem to be going well, people generally do not want to spoil the situation by taking risks. On the other hand, when things are not going so well, that is, there are more losses than gains, they are willing to take greater risks. The theory focuses on two components of decision making. One is called the framing or editing aspect, and the other one is referred to as the evaluation aspect. Framing or editing refers to the form in which options or choices are placed before the decision maker, that is, the way in which the problem or situation is framed. For example, which component of the alternatives is emphasized, the gains or the losses? This aspect influences decision making through several cognitive processes. The main cognitive processes under framing that Tversky and Kahneman highlighted were as follows: acceptance, which refers to taking the information as it is given; segregation, focusing only on what seems to be immediately relevant and separating it out from the rest of the information; coding, which is the tendency to classify the outcomes in terms of gains and losses rather than other long-term consequences; combination, which is the tendency to sum the probabilities of outcomes that are similar; cancellation, which refers to ruling out outcomes that have similar probability; simplification and detection of dominance, that is, rounding off and discounting outcomes with low probabilities. In other words, the way in which a problem or situation involving decision making is framed or worded affects the cognitive processes that will come to the fore when the individual makes a decision. Evaluation, the second component that was highlighted in prospect theory, involves weighing or assessing the alternatives presented to the decision maker. This aspect, according to the authors of this theory, includes two functions: the value function and the weighting function. Both of these are calculated mathematically following certain other models that apply particularly to economic situations. In addition to the prospect theory, there is yet another model that gets quite a bit of attention in organizational decision-making contexts. This is a normative decision-making model which is applied to managerial and organizational settings. What is interesting about this model is that it does not involve things like the utility or value as such of the alternatives. Instead, it focuses on the relationship between the leader and the group members or some other aspects of decision making, behaviorally speaking, that the leader has to undertake. The model is presented in the form of a decision tree. It provides systematic information to a leader, that is the decision maker, to decide what decision style would be most appropriate in a particular context after considering a set of questions in a given sequence. It is this sequence that is laid out very neatly in the decision tree. The questions involve organizational components that are relevant for decision making. Here are the components that are included in the questions that form the base of the Vroom-Yetton-Jago model. These questions have to be posed in sequence, followed by alternative answers. Quality requirement: is it high or is it low? Commitment requirement: is this high or is it low? Leader's information: is it sufficient? Yes, or is it not sufficient? No. The problem structure: is it clear? Yes or no? Commitment probability: is it certain? Yes or no? Goal congruence with subordinates: yes or no? Subordinate conflict: is it likely? Yes or no? And subordinate information: is it present? Yes or no? Depending on the combination of answers to each question in sequence, that is, whether the answer is high or low, or yes or no, 5 decision-making styles emerge. The leader should adopt the appropriate style as applicable. 5 decision-making styles, according to this model, are as follows: autocratic 1, autocratic 2, consultative 1, consultative 2, and group 2. A brief description of each of these is now given. In autocratic 1, the style is such that the leader makes the decision using available information that he or she has on his or her own. In autocratic 2, the leader gets information from other group members, but makes the decision individually. The group is not necessarily informed. Consultative 1, this style is such that group members are consulted individually but not collectively. Information and evaluation of the decision-making situation is sought from the members. The leader makes the decision individually. In consultative 2, group members are consulted as a group, that is collectively. Information and evaluation are sought. But again, the leader makes the decision individually. And finally, in group 2, also called collaborative, the leader meets group members and guides the discussion without imposing his or her opinions and will on the group members. It is then the group that makes the decision. These decision-making styles have been presented along with leadership according to the Vroom-Yetton-Jago model. But independently of this model also, decision-making styles have been discussed in fairly great detail by other experts. The decision-making style aspect of the process called decision-making brings out the role of personality characteristics of decision makers. Often, the decision-making style is the result of personal characteristics interacting with situational features, because it is very difficult to imagine a decision maker making his decisions or judgments totally or entirely on the basis of his or her own personal characteristics. More than one classification or categorization of decision-making styles have been proposed in the existing literature. Some of these classifications do overlap. Let us take a look at some of the major classifications. Decision-making styles 1. Following the propositions made by Rowe and Boulgaridis, 4 kinds of decision-making styles based on 2 dimensions have been proposed and described. The 2 dimensions are way of thinking, rational or intuitive thinking, and tolerance of ambiguity or tolerance for ambiguity, which may be high or low. Let us take a look at the combinations of these 2 dimensions. When we take a look at high tolerance of ambiguity combined with a rational way of thinking or an intuitive way of thinking, we find the high tolerance of ambiguity combined with rational way of thinking combination leading to something called analytical decision-making style. If the tolerance of ambiguity is high, but the way of thinking is intuitive rather than rational, the result is something called conceptual decision-making style. We go further. On the other hand, if tolerance of ambiguity is low and the way of thinking is rational, a directive decision-making style results. The 4th combination is one of low tolerance of ambiguity with an intuitive way of thinking, and this is called the behavioral decision-making style. We will take a very brief look at each of these styles simply to highlight certain characteristics that emerge in each of these decision-making styles. The characteristics of the analytical decision-making style are: such a person has a rational way of thinking primarily. He or she has greater tolerance for unstructured situations, that is, a fair amount of ambiguity can exist in the situation, and yet this decision maker will not find the context difficult to tackle. Such a decision maker considers all alternatives properly, tries to take in as much of the information as is possible, and people who have analytical decision style are typically careful or cautious decision makers. In the case of the directive style, we find that the person has a rational way of thinking, of course, but this is combined with a low tolerance for unstructured information. That is, if the context does not provide clear-cut information that has no other alternative way of being interpreted, such a decision maker does face some problems. A person who has a directive decision making style believes in efficient and logical decision making, something like a no-nonsense decision maker. He or she focuses on the short term rather than on long-term consequences and tends to make quick decisions that may not include all options. So, even though there would be clarity and probably a kind of structure in the final decision that emerges, perhaps there will be some limitations in such a decision because it might have left out some other important alternatives. The third decision-making style, called conceptual style, is one in which the decision maker takes a broader approach that may be non-rational. This might mean that although rationality is allowed for, it is the intuitive kind of thinking that tends to dominate. Such decision makers have high tolerance for unstructured information. They tend to consider long-term implications of decisions. They try to consider all options that are possible in the context and are more likely than the other three kinds of decision makers to show what is known as creative or innovative decision making. The fourth decision making style, called behavioral style, is one in which the decision maker prefers structured information because he or she has a low tolerance of ambiguity, but is still open to suggestions because such a person is intuitive rather than rational in his or her way of thinking. Such decision makers tend to be oriented towards team achievement and therefore believe that relationships with group members are important. Thus, they tend to avoid conflict with others and value acceptance by others. In other words, a behavioral style decision maker is one who is likely to have good personal relationships with the other members and to take them along as he or she makes a decision. A second kind of classification of decision making styles is now familiar in these four letters that are put together, the MBTI, which stands for the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. The MBTI as a scale or a measuring tool was itself inspired many years ago by Carl Jung's classification of personality into types. The classification originally involved two attitudes, introversion and extroversion, and four functions, namely thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. This classification into types and the two dimensions or coordinates that have been mentioned were Carl Jung's classification. However, as time went by, Myers-Briggs developed the idea proposed by Jung in much greater detail and also devised a measuring instrument. In fact, it is in the form of questionnaires, but the interpretation of the responses goes much beyond a simple scoring of the responses given by people who are administered this tool. The present version of MBTI is used very commonly in organizational settings because of its alleged link with decision making. This link assumes that personality by itself plays a major role in decision making, to some extent even independently of the situation or the context. The MBTI involves combinations of four dimensions. In this respect, some modification has been made in the original thinking of Carl Jung. The four dimensions that are measured in the MBTI are introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling, and judging, perceiving. What is done in this tool is to take the responses given by individuals and to see which combination they fit into best of all. 16 combinations have been proposed, and as mentioned earlier, these 16 combinations can be known by using a questionnaire measure. We turn our attention now to some of the commonly used decision making techniques in situations that involve either some kind of problem solving or some kind of decision making. In many common everyday kinds of situations, decision making tends to be intuitive and does not always follow a specific plan or strategy. But then there are several contexts and domains that do require specific decision making techniques. Such techniques are adopted mainly because it is felt that they would lead to better decisions, that is, would at least prevent the decision maker and the group as a whole from facing some negative or unpleasant and irreversible consequences, and happily perhaps lead them to better outcomes also. The best known technique, if at all that word can be used, is what we call planning. Of course, planning can be a part of any activity that human beings engage in, but when we talk about decision making also, if it is planned, what it does is the whole process of decision making, all the thinking, etc., that goes into this process gets systematized, and all the steps that are involved in this process also take place more smoothly. This method is adopted when decision making needs are known earlier. This statement applies to any context in which planning is done, because the word itself, the concept of planning itself, assumes that there is an anticipatory element, so people know what they are moving towards. There is also a goal orientation. Some of the procedures that go into planning as a decision making technique are note taking. In fact, copious notes are taken. Many people write out their daily schedule with respect to what aspects of the problem have to be tackled day by day. Making flow charts and similar steps. All of these imply a planned approach to decision making, in contrast to a spontaneous, unplanned, and usually intuitive kind of decision making. A second method, which is referred to as the pros and cons method, has also been described. This can also be, in a sense, considered to be one kind of planned decision making technique. It assumes, first of all, that alternatives in the decision making context are known, at least to a fair extent. Along with the alternatives, the positive points and negative points of each alternative, including the outcomes and consequences of each, are also known, or at least are found out, and then are listed systematically, compared with each other, and evaluated. One might be reminded at this stage of the kind of suggestions given by popular writers like Dale Carnegie, who ask us to plan their day, to think ahead a little, and sometimes in a very personal way make our own notes and make our own comparisons between things that seem to be not so good and those that appear to be better. What is being pointed to is the fact that perhaps it is a good idea to pay active attention to the fact that no matter how simple or easy a decision making situation appears to be, the alternatives and options that are available are not always straightforward. Each of them may have some good points, but also some limitations. Listing them systematically, of course, helps in comparing them and evaluating them. This method works well for both individual or personal and group-based decisions, but only if complete and correct information is available, particularly about the alternatives that face that situation. A third decision-making technique, called brainstorming has also come into use, particularly in the last 4 or 5 decades. Initially, the term brainstorming was used in the context of creative problem solving in groups. So, the presence of a group is a prerequisite for something called brainstorming. This method is also, like some of the other methods, used fairly commonly in educational and organizational settings. Here is how the procedure called brainstorming usually takes place. First, a group is invited to participate in brainstorming. They are told what the problem is, but nothing is said about the solution to begin with. The group members are then instructed to come up on their own with as many ideas as possible towards solving the problem or making a decision. A third rule that applies in brainstorming, and rather strictly, is that no evaluation of the presented ideas is permitted, either by the presenters themselves or by other group members. The idea behind this rule is that creative ideas should be allowed to come out spontaneously. If the individual gets an idea which appears to be crazy or unwieldy or not worth talking about, the person perhaps may not express that idea at all. In order to take away that inhibition, the rule is put down very clearly that nobody in the group, including the presenter, is going to start by evaluating the idea that comes out. But later on, of course, some kind of evaluation does take place. After everyone has presented their ideas, they are listed carefully, and the most practical and best ideas out of these are selected. If found appropriate, they are also implemented. One advantage of something like brainstorming is that, number one, because it is a group situation rather than an individual or person-based situation, the likelihood that many more ideas that can be implemented will come out is also much higher. Secondly, since no evaluation is permitted, people feel free to express their ideas, but at the end of the brainstorming session, it is only the meaningful and practical ideas that will be implemented anyway. The chances of such ideas being creative, innovative and novel happen to be higher, and that means that the likelihood of not just having a solution or decision, but having a creative decision or solution is also higher. There is also a technique which is referred to as the Delphi technique. This technique is typically used only in managerial or organizational settings. It is a group-based decision-making technique that is used for forecasting in organizational and business settings. Basically, the Delphi technique involves 3 steps. The first step is to gather relevant and detailed information about the issue at hand from experts. This is an important condition. The source of the information in the Delphi technique is a group of chosen experts. Once this information is collected, some structure and order is imposed on this information by the person who is leading this panel of experts. It is important to note that at this step, that is at the first step of information gathering, there is no face-to-face interaction which will inhibit either the expression of opinions and ideas or will bring in an unnecessary or undesirable evaluative component. The second step is that after the information is collected and after some structure and order has been imposed on the information, it is sent back to the participants for feedback. This is of course a repeated process. The panel, in other words, looks at its own ideas, of course along with the ideas presented by other members, and in a sense they comment on their own forecasting. Incidentally, the element of forecasting is also built into the Delphi technique, because when it was initiated, this was one of the major purposes of using the technique. So, not only do the experts provide ideas related to problem solving or decision making, but they also build in a forecasting element. Finally, the third aspect of the Delphi technique that needs mention is that anonymity of the participants is maintained. In some cases, when it becomes necessary, names are disclosed, but only with the point of view of efficiently using them. Let us now take a look at the factors that influence decision making as a whole. If one looks at the research on decision making, the list of such determinants or factors would be very long. Here, however, we have tried to condense the number of factors into a few points so that there can be a focused look at what kind of variables are likely to influence decision making, either known to the decision maker or not known to the decision maker. We begin with the first set of factors, which are best referred to as cognitive biases. These are purely psychological and cognitive variables. In the context of judgment and decision making, particularly in the context of judgment, that is, where there is no action necessarily required after the judgment, two biases are mentioned by psychologists. One is called the availability heuristic, and the other one is called the representativeness heuristic. A heuristic in cognitive psychology is the term that is used for the fact. It is a procedure or mechanism that is used by individuals for any kind of cognitive activity, which is employed or adopted as a shortcut, so that there is cognitive efficiency or cognitive economy. That is, stored information of various kinds get converted into simple rule of thumb kinds of algorithms, and usually unknown to the person concerned, get involved in the task of information processing, which may be related to people, which may be related to situations or decisions, and so on. The availability heuristic is an aspect which tells us that this is more likely simply because it comes to one's mind most readily. So, for example, if we have to make a judgment about a human being and we are told that this person belongs to a certain community in which the number of musicians, noted musicians, is fairly high, without any further information, if the music component comes to our mind most readily, we jump to the conclusion and make the judgment that this person is likely to be a good musician. We could, of course, be completely wrong in that kind of judgment. The second heuristic, called the representativeness heuristic, has some similar qualities, but essentially the idea is not identical to the availability heuristic. In the representativeness heuristic, if a target seems to fit the major characteristics of a particular class, and this class could contain people or objects or even ideas, then all the features and actions related to that class will be attributed to the target. Both of these heuristics create a kind of bias in an individual. Incidentally, the word bias in the context of cognitive psychology and cognitive processing is not always to be used in a negative sense. The idea behind a bias is to increase efficiency by reducing cognitive effort. However, it is also true that whenever such biases come into the picture, the chances of erroneous decisions and judgments becomes much higher. A second variable that also has been tested out through research is the number of alternatives available in a decision-making situation. From everyday experience and common observation, one knows that if there are too many alternatives, this may increase the complexity and also the time needed for decision making. Although this need not be true in all situations, it is a common experience that people have found to be true. They find it easier to make their decisions faster, more quickly, if they do not have to choose between many alternatives. At the same time though, at the opposite end, if there are too few alternatives, the person may feel that he or she has been restricted and is now not free enough to make a choice or a decision properly. Now, one question that comes up in practical life, especially in the context of buying and selling, perhaps in economics and perhaps also in everyday decisions that we make, is, do people actually like to have many choices? The answer that researchers have given is that this is not necessary. In general, individuals might say that they would like to have a wider range of choices to choose from. But in actuality, as shown in the research of Dr. Sheena Iyengar, more choices may actually make the final action or decision less likely. She has given examples of how in a shopping complex or in a particular store, if a certain product such as jam is shown or put on display in terms of many varieties, buyers or potential buyers are more likely to come and test each of these jams. But when it comes to actual purchasing of any one of these jams, they are more likely to do so when the number of brands or the variety is much less. A third variable that of course has been shown to affect or influence decision making is personality characteristics. It has been said earlier and we reiterate it again that personality characteristics in the context of decision making usually do not act on their own. Rather, they interact with situational features and thereby come out in the form either of a decision-making style or simply show their influence on the kind of decision that is made. The first characteristic that definitely requires to be highlighted here is creativity or innovativeness of the decision maker. It is said that all of us have creative potential, but the fact is that not all of us either find it necessary to use it or do not find the opportunity for creative expression, especially by way of decision making. When individuals are actually placed in decision making situations, especially in the role, let us say, of an executive or a manager, here is an opportunity for them to exercise their creativity. So in this sense, a person who has high creativity or innovativeness is likely to convert the same drab decision-making situation into a creative one. A second personality characteristic that also has been mentioned in the context of decision-making styles is tolerance for ambiguity. This variable was discovered quite some time ago but it has its extensions in more than one concept. Simply stated, tolerance for ambiguity or tolerance of ambiguity simply means that an individual can accept or live with ambiguous information, that is, information that can be interpreted in more than one way, or has a low tolerance for this kind of situation. A person who is high on tolerance of ambiguity usually can live with opposites. That is in fact a simple way, a straightforward way of putting the situation. So, even if there are opposites or contradictories in the same situation, such a person, one who has high tolerance for ambiguity, would not find such a situation upsetting or difficult to understand. On the other hand, people who are low on tolerance for ambiguity find it comfortable to deal with structured, clear situations. So, they would believe, for example, in giving clear instructions to their subordinates if they are in an executive role. If they are in the role of a decision maker and they are looking for information, they would be much more comfortable if the information is given to them in a clear, straightforward way with no ambiguities. The third variable, once again pertaining to personality, is a set of cognitive style variables. Cognitive style goes a little beyond pure personality and combines with it some form of information processing. Hence, the term cognitive is attached to this variable. There could be more than one cognitive style variable that comes into the picture when decisions are made, but here is one that has not got the attention that it has probably deserved, and that is called reflectivity impulsivity, a variable that was in a sense discovered by Jerome Kagan. A reflective person is one who looks at all options very carefully and therefore ends up taking a longer time in making decisions. However, such decisions are more likely to be appropriate. By contrast, a person who is higher on impulsivity is too eager to make a quick decision. In doing so, the person of course may end up making an appropriate decision, but the chances of that being the case are smaller simply because such a person would not have looked at all possible options. Finally, we have the concept of thinking styles, also extended to and made part of decision making styles. Thinking styles are a concept that have been proposed by Robert Sternberg and have been modified by some other psychologists. These include cognitive ways of looking at situations, but have a very strong personality component in terms of preferences for certain kinds of information and also ways of dealing with information. We also need to talk about cultural factors in the context of decision making. There are some studies that show that the style of making decisions as well as the kind of decisions that are made, perhaps also the process that people go through in making a decision, seems to differ between certain cultures. One explanation for such cross-cultural differences could be that some cultures encourage independent thinking more than others, place greater importance on following conventional ideas and do not allow for deviations from them. They also place greater importance on taking the group along, that is, keeping interpersonal relationships in harmony, or on respecting decisions taken by authority simply because they have been taken by persons who are in certain higher positions. Members of different cultures also vary in what certain authors like Noble, Sander and Obenschein call belief maps. as well as political and historical background. This finding and observation comes from a set of studies conducted by these authors as well as some others. These variables, called belief maps, that vary between cultures also affect the approach taken to decision making. We now come to the end of our discussion of decision making as an example of a higher cognitive process. It would be a good idea to give some active examples of situations in which even small decisions are taken. We may, for example, take the case of a multiple choice item in an examination, or we may take the idea of choosing between options with uncertain outcomes, as for instance is sometimes shown on popular television shows. A third case, which is a social one, is an example of the following kind. There is something called the prisoner's dilemma game, which essentially poses a conflict between two options, and two persons or players who are participating in this game are also faced with the question of making a decision.